Joining us now in studio, Anna Porter, author of The Ghosts of Europe, Journeys Through Central Europe's Troubled Past and Uncertain Future. Welcome. Nice to have you in that chair.
Nice to be asked.
Here we go. I'm going to read a little excerpt from the book, which will set up our conversation. Michael, if you would, please. Looking back on the past 20 years in Central Europe with anxiety rather than the exuberant, optimistic hopes for the future with which I greeted the dismantling of the walls and barbed wire barriers that separated West from East. My travels across the borderlands of Central Europe found not only new open societies, but also fear, disappointment, anger, insecurity, and cloying nationalism, chords that echo the murky past of these regions, a past that included fascism and the rise of the Nazi Party. Anna Porter, let's do a little background first. Born in Hungary, left in '56 when that nascent democratic movement was snuffed out, moved to New Zealand, and then eventually Canada. Let's go back to 1989, when the wall came down in Berlin. Did you think that Central Europe would become more like us?
Actually, I didn't believe it would last.
What would last?
That the wall coming down, I kept thinking that the Russians would not allow it to happen long term, and that the Americans and the West would not interfere if the Russians decided that it was not to be. Now, when the Berlin Wall, in my mind, it all began really in Poland already, and I was watching the news, and I was very aware of all the events and the shipyard workers. I was aware of Valencia. I was aware of what was happening in '89. But I didn't think the Russians would allow the round table of former dissidents, strikers, and the old communist government. I didn't think they would allow them to sit down and discuss democratic reform.
You're such a pessimist, and that comes out in your book very much. But
well, but by time, you mentioned the wall, by the time people were dancing on the remnants of the wall, I began to think that it would last.
And here we've got a former Czech president that you quote in your book saying, "We now have democracy. All we need are some Democrats." As you look at the countries that have their own homegrown Democrats and those that don't, what's the biggest difference between the two?
You know, there are a lot of Democrats in that part of the world. It's just that our notion of exporting democracy in the way that you might export cars or exotic fruit is not, it can't be done. It has to, the desire for democracy has to come from within. And a lot of people in what used to be the Eastern Bloc really wanted free speech, and they wanted to be able to vote. They wanted a say in their own government. They really wanted it. So they accepted it when it happened. However, they weren't necessarily all that keen on what came with it. And what came with it was capitalism.
We're going to pick up on that, but before we get there, you do make the point that the countries that are making good faith efforts to reckon with their past seem to be doing better than those that aren't. So let's look at some. I want to start with Poland, since you talked about Wałęsa a minute ago. You met Wojciech Jaruzelski. You sat down with the guy who imposed martial law in December of 1981. He said, in order that I'll do this so the Soviets won't bring their tanks in and take over the entire country. So with the advantage of almost 30 years of hindsight, did he convince you that he did the right thing?
He was very convincing. I did believe that he believed that the Russians would invade, and that he believed that the Polish army would resist, that they would not allow the Russians to march in.
And there'd be a bloodbath.
And there would be a blood. I mean, the Poles are actually pretty damn good fighters. You know, they were famous for fighting in the Second World War. They were rewarded with communism. They were rewarded with having no say in their own future. So, you know, we had also treated them fairly badly. I mean in the West. They would have resisted. So I believed that. Now, everything about that man I reacted to negatively. He made my hair bristle. I felt
Well, does he still wear the sunglasses and look quite odd?
Yes.
He still does all that.
He does, and he looks very stiff, and he looks very army man-ish. However, he does the, you know, the Polish kiss the hand thing,
And when
which
you
I
told
thought was
him,
lovely.
When you told him that Yuri Andropov, it has emerged, said, we wouldn't have brought the troops in if he hadn't done this martial law thing. We would have worked out a deal with Solidarity. Is he moved by that?
No, he's not moved by anything. He's very, very, very stiff. The only thing he was really moved by, oddly enough, he was complaining about the lack of enthusiasm for his second book. He was not getting quite the treatment. His first book was very popular. It had sold extremely well. And the second book, people were not lining up to buy it. And he was, you know, like every other author in every other country I've ever met, disappointed.
I wonder if that means that Poland is becoming a more normal country, and that's a good thing.
I think so? Poland is becoming a much more normal country. And Poland did quite well through this tough economic crisis period. Did very well. I mean, did better than many of the countries. I mean, did obviously a lot better than Greece and a lot better than Spain and Portugal. Did very, very well, and still doing well. And its relationship with Russia, albeit still raw, is being extremely well managed.
And they love the Americans more than anybody in Europe, probably.
They are very fond of the Americans.
Yeah. Okay, country two, Czech Republic. Jan Urban told you, quote, Czechs don't want to remember the past because memory could mean having to take responsibility.
Yes.
For what?
Having to take responsibility, amongst other things, for what happened to the Jews. And people don't talk about this a whole lot, but what's left of that great center of Jewish culture in Prague now is what Hitler had originally dreamt of when he was going to have a kind of a museum to the Jews, and it was going to be those few empty spaces that used to be synagogues and cemeteries in the middle of Prague. So that's one thing that they stood by. They did nothing. They allowed it to happen, and in fact, in many cases, they aided the expulsion of their neighbors. That was the first thing, but I think perhaps equally importantly, but perhaps more importantly, he meant what happened after. The security service in that country, in Czechoslovakia, which is what it was at that time, was really more repressive, I think, than in any of the other countries. Lasted longer than the other countries. Mm-hmm. And for it to be able to operate, it needed a lot of people who were willing to tell stories on their neighbors. And what the Czechs still have, and the Slovaks and the Hungarians still have a lot of trouble with, is how to deal with the collaborators. How do you deal with your neighbor, your friend, your wife, your husband?
And they haven't dealt with any of this yet, or not enough?
They're not nearly enough.
How about this, in terms of collaborators? How often does Neville Chamberlain's name still come up in your conversations, and the fact that he sold the Czechs up the river 70 years ago for peace in our time with honor?
Every time.
Really, still?
It comes up all the time. Huh. That is still, his comment about how, you know, that who knows where Czechoslovakia is or cares, that it still rankles. Each of these countries, it seemed to me, when talking to people, has a trauma that keeps bubbling to the surface. For the Hungarians, it's Trianon. Trianon is...
We're going to get there. Hold off on Hungary yet.
But for them, that's it.
Okay, let me go to Slovakia then, the other half of the divorce. How's the divorce going between the Czechs and the Slovaks?
Extremely well, as far as both sides. One of the things I heard no complaints about, really, except a few intellectuals who felt that it should not have happened at all. But now that it's happened, it's okay.
Well, let me follow up, because you tell a story about, you talk to a writer-politician whose name I can't remember right now. I'll read you the quote and you'll remember. We're becoming an authoritarian country run by people with no ideology, just an insatiable hunger for power. The word fascism doesn't fit, but this is becoming an intolerant, highly centralized nationalist state. Talking about Slovakia. Talk to us about this language law.
The Hungarian language laws? Or, well, actually, they're language laws, but they were intended specifically to suppress the Hungarian minority. They exist, they're there. Their sole purpose is to make life uncomfortable for Hungarians now.
Do they not see this as being inconsistent with democracy?
No. They have no problem with it whatsoever. The guys who instituted these laws think it's eminently fair because the Hungarians suppressed them for several hundred years, so long ago that nobody alive can even remember how it was. It's tit for tat. And they seem to think it's kind of payback time.
And you told the story of a say we're in a Hungarian hospital, and a Hungarian doctor wants to treat a Hungarian patient in Hungarian. That's illegal now.
Yes, well, these are Slovak Hungarians.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're in Slovakia, but they're ethnically Hungarian.
Yes.
And this makes sense because?
Because they have to be able to speak Slovak, because Slovak is the national language. And, you know, I mean, they're thinking back in the 1840s, when, right throughout that 19th century period, when Hungarians were anxious about the growth of the populations, the non-Hungarian speaking populations in the mostly peripheral areas of Hungary, and they wanted to have a unilingual greater Hungary, and they were suppressing the Slovak language. Well, that's what they're thinking about.
Let's go to Hungary then. This is the one if I read your book correctly, this is the one Eastern European country where they are unambiguously saying things were better before.
Not everybody.
Not everybody
isn't
but
saying
the majority. The majority of the people, according to that Pew Research poll that you quoted.
Yes, I did quote.
The majority of the people think Hungary was better off before.
You know, I mean, here's the thing.
Explain that.
Here's the thing. Before when everybody was poor, you looked at your neighbor and the guy across the street, and you knew that you were equally suppressed, your views were equally unimportant, and neither of you had anything. None of you had anything. You were all, you know, you all had to line up for bread, and none of you could afford more than one pair of shoes.
But there was equality in misery.
Total equality. Now, for some, it's much better. And that shines a light on the others for whom it's not better, and in some cases it's marginally worse.
I must say, moving on to another issue now, and that is post-Holocaust coming to terms with. I've always been amazed at how you, a non-Jew, is so focused and interested and have written so eloquently about issues related to the Holocaust. And you point out in this book as well that you know, various countries in Central Europe are doing variously well at coming to terms with this aspect of their past. And we should start in Poland here because, you know, one Polish writer told you, how can wiping out 1/3 of its urban population be anything other than the central issue of Poland's history? Is it?
Is it the central issue?
Yeah.
It's one of the central issues.
One of, okay.
It's become, we're talking about national traumas. It does not supplant the massacre of Polish officers in Katyn forests in terms of a national issue, but it is a big national issue, and it's a subject of constant discussion and debate. And I think that's a good thing because the Poles are facing their own history.
Unlike in Hungary.
Unlike in Hungary.
They're
not dealing with it. They're trying.
In Hungary?
No.
In Poland, but not in Hungary.
In Hungary, there's a Hungarian right-wing party led by an absolutely stunningly lovely woman. You would enjoy meeting her.
I looked her up online. She's what, 45, 46 years old?
She's a blonde beauty.
Yeah.
She's soft-spoken. She's lovely. And she leads a party that is openly anti-Semitic and anti-Roma. It is a racist party. And they're you know, in elections, they're able to run ads in newspapers that we have laws against. They can run them. Now, I think the whole country's in some kind of denial. There's a museum, it's called the Museum of Terror, in the middle of Budapest, which supposedly shows both the terror pre-communism and during communism. And essentially the terror pre-communism is Nazi times in Hungary, except that about 12% of all the rooms and all the exhibits in this museum deal with that horrendous time of Hungarian history. 450,000 fellow citizens who were doctors and lawyers and politicians.
But not thought of really as fellow citizens.
Well,
not really.
But that's the issue.
Yeah.
I don't know how, and they were murdered. I mean, is this not, you're asking me why I care about it. It's so obvious. It cries out for someone to start a debate and discuss it in Hungary. They're not doing it.
In which case, in our last minute, let me ask you this. When you've gone back, you've done the tour, you've spent lots of time, you met Otto von Habsburg, the grandson of, right? Do you despair when you think about where Eastern Europe is today?
No. No, I don't. The young people are really wonderful, including the young people I met in Hungary. Of course, they don't know the history, but they are hopeful. They're traveling. They're working abroad. They're working at home. They find the disappearance of borders to be wonderful. I am really enthusiastic about the future of the area. I think it's going to be okay. It'll just take time.